Hello, my name is Betsy Corcoran, and I am co-founder and CEO of EdSurge. And we are really thrilled to have you joining us today on a great webinar, How AR and VR Encourages Students to Achieve the Impossible. So just a couple of thoughts before we get rolling. Again, EdSurge is a news and information resource. We help bring you the best in education technology through our news stories and research programs, community activities, and that includes live conferences and things like this webinar. Today's webinar is, like I said, going to be really fun. We have all been looking forward to this. We have a fantastic group of educators and tech experts for this conversation on augmented reality and virtual reality. And one more quick note, we will be recording this webinar, and the recording will be made available to you via email after the event. I'd like to start by thanking ZSpace for the support that makes this webinar possible. ZSpace is a hardware and software solution that combines elements of AR and VR, and it creates some pretty cool lifelike experiences that are very immersive and interactive for students. You can ask questions throughout this webinar using that little Q&A function in Zoom down at the bottom of your screen. And I will do my very level best to bring all your questions into the discussion as we go along. Okay? So first, a quick introduction of today's panelists. It's a pretty cool group of people. We have with us Dr. Jeremy Valenson, who is a professor of communication at Stanford University, although he is lurking in New York City these days. He's the founding director of Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab and has a ton of awards, and most importantly has done a really seminal book on AR and VR. He studies psychology of these things and how virtual experiences really lead to changes in perception of both the self and of others. Secondly, we have Aaliyah Henderson Rosser, who's the Executive Director for Instructional Technology in the Atlanta Public Schools. Before she became a director, she worked in a whole range of educational roles in DeKalb County school system. She has a doctorate in educational policy and leadership from Georgia State University and is super involved both nationally and internationally and has just done a tremendous amount for the students in Georgia.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Joe Parlier, who is the Senior Director for ZSpace Educational Solutions, and he works with schools all across the country. In fact, he's on a road show right now, not really a road show, but really a school visit tour across the country. And he is focused on integrating AR and VR into the curriculum. And he's had a long career in education. He's been a teacher and a principal and an administrator in states and districts, so he has tons of experience in making things work. We will also be joined, we believe, by Michael Torrance, who's president of Montlow State Community College. He's held a number of professional roles in higher education, and his research and consulting interests include literacy, diversity, gender equality, developmental education, and how to use technology as an effective education resource. He also has a PhD in exceptional learning from Tennessee Technological University. Before we really dive in, we're going to do two things. We're going to define a couple of our terms, and we're going to give you a little peek at some AR and VR. And then we're going to jump into this conversation. So first, a couple of definitions. What are we talking about here? We use a lot of these terms interchangeably, but augmented reality means that we're adding digital elements to a live view of something, and it can be on a camera or a smartphone. And of course, the whole Pokemon Go sort of experience that we had a couple summers ago was a really good example of augmented reality. Virtual reality, by contrast, means complete immersion. It's shutting out the physical world. And the idea is that users are really transported into a real world or maybe an imagined world kind of environment. And then, not surprisingly, mixed reality. You get both. You get a little bit of AR, you get a little bit of VR, you get a little bit of real world, a little bit of digital objects. Now, there's probably 1,000 different ways to define these, but these are going to be the definitions that we're going to bear in mind when we're thinking about this. So what are teachers saying about VR? Well, this is some data from a 2016 survey of over 600 teachers that Samsung did. And quite a few of them think that VR could be really useful at least once a month in the classroom. They also believe that VR could enable students to see places they would not otherwise be able to go. And that's one of the topics we're going to cover today. So what does this stuff look like? We're going to take about 1 minute and look at a short video that'll give you some sense of what we're talking about. So here we go. Okay, so that starts to give you a little bit of a sense of what are students experiencing when they are starting to use these kinds of technologies. I'd love to start off with Jeremy. Jeremy, you have literally written the book on what AR and VR means, and you coined this term called DICE, which includes doing things that are otherwise dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, and of course, expensive. Take us into that a little bit more. What was really behind this idea of DICE, and why does AR and VR, why is that really the way that we can start to have these kinds of experiences?
Thank you. And first, let me start by saying thanks for organizing this amazing panel. What a treat to be with my colleagues on this webinar, and thanks to ZSpace for building a really neat product that we all like to use. I've been studying virtual reality since 1999 and augmented reality as well. Over the years, we found out that VR is an amazing tool. It gives you experiences you couldn't have otherwise. It puts a gain factor on training and learning. It really does things that other media cannot. That being said, VR is not for everything. VR is a very special experience, and we should think about it as an experience, not as a media experience. So the smart way for our listeners to think about it is VR is not like checking your email. It's not like using another medium. You're doing something, you're using your body. And so DICE comes from a survey of 20 years of research from myself and other amazing scholars in the field, which is the success cases of VR really center around things that in the real world would be very difficult to do. And these are things that are dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, and expensive. Let's start with dangerous. VR comes from the flight simulator. In 1929, Edwin Link wanted to learn how to fly. How do we learn? We do stuff, we make mistakes, we get feedback, and we repeat. That's how the learning process works. That's a very expensive process in a plane, very dangerous to do that. So hence we make the flight simulator. Impossible. These are things that you absolutely could not do in the real world. So one of the best use cases in the history of virtual reality is this idea of teaching people empathy and understanding of others. I can change my body so that I'm a different gender, a different race, a different age, a different body shape. And you can actually have an experience walking in the mile in someone else's shoes you couldn't have in the real world. And that's just simply impossible to do. Great use case for VR. Counterproductive. These are experiences, if you did them in the real world, it wouldn't be great for you. You'd suffer a cost. However, you'd learn a life lesson. These are these teachable moments that are just really special, but they come at a cost. And the example I like to give in this one is if a father from the 1970s caught his son smoking cigarettes, he'd force the son to go into a closet and smoke a carton. And yes, you'd learn a lesson there, but it would come at a big cost to your lungs. And VR can kind of give you these intense lessons about how behaviors affect the body without having to actually change your health. The final one is expensive. And this really, a lot of these come into that. In the video we just saw, we saw an amazing demo of let's take out a human cadaver and let's take it apart and put it back together. And cadavers are really expensive. And to be able to do that at scale and to give every single student on the planet the opportunity to play with a real cadaver is just an amazing tool. And so to sum up, VR, AR, I don't want us in 3-5 years to be putting on goggles just to read our email, to have a basic conversation. I want to keep the classroom how it is. I want to have group discussions. I want to use VR as an amazing tool that augments the classroom for these special experiences.
That's terrific. That's great. Aaliyah, you are in the classroom, or you are kind of creating these classroom environments for people. So I'd love to hear from you. What does this look like on the ground in your district? And this idea that Jeremy talked about using your body, does that fit with what your students are starting to experience?
It absolutely does fit. And thanks again to you, Betsy, and EdSurge, and Joe, who's a great ZSpace partner. We do a lot of ZSpace work here in Atlanta Public Schools. And one of the things that our superintendent challenged us with, each school, was to choose a signature program. So what does your school want to study and do and be? And so some schools have chosen an IB route, International Baccalaureate route, but a lot of schools have chosen STEM. And knowing that there's a nationwide shortage around, careers and students choosing career paths in STEM, STEM expertise, and that learning has just kind of taken off. And so what we've done here in APS is each school has to choose that signature programming. I would say 60 or 70% of our schools have chosen STEM, and they are also using it from an engineering standpoint, a health sciences standpoint. And so that can become very expensive. If you really want students to have authentic, real world application of those things, you've got to keep that up. And to be a STEM certified school, you've got to have true technology integration throughout every subject. And AR, VR kind of allows us to do some of those things that, just as Jeremy is saying, can be cost effective. We cannot buy some of these things for every single classroom, but if you have a lab of AR, VR machines, then students can experience some of these things on their own. Things like bringing in understanding the circulatory system and the muscular skeletal system, and each student being able to dive into that and really peel back the layers, literally, and look into the human body, explore the human eye in a way that you may not be able to do that in real life. Build circuits and roller coasters and test Newton's theories and see all the different things that can happen as you change the different variables. I mean, it's a world that we're unable to give our students just looking at them face to face. We've got to submerge them in something else. And AR, VR allows us that kind of solution. So for the type of learning that we're doing in APS, it's perfect for right now. And it gets the point across. Students are very excited about it because, I mean, imagine, I just remember being a science teacher, in the early 90s and going to the farmer's market, which isn't far from where I am right now, and buying a bag of sheep hearts to bring in. Disgusting, but awesome at the same time. But I didn't have enough for all 120 of my students. So this time you get a fresh heart every time you open up that ZSpace laptop and you get to go and peel back the layers as far as you need to. And so with shrinking budgets, this kind of investment, I think, goes a long way with schools.
That is fantastic. And Aaliyah, the fact that you were able to haul sheep parts back from the farmer's market, I think speaks worlds to the kind of teacher that you are. That's amazing.
I think I have to amend the definition of dangerous here.
I know, right?
Sheep parts.
I know.
That's pretty awesome. Folks online, I'm so excited about the kinds of questions you're asking. We're going to get to them in 1 minute. I want to give Joe, I have one question for Joe, and then I'm going to dive instantly into the questions that you guys are asking, because these are really good ones and very important ones. But give me 1 minute to get in one question for Joe here. Joe, you really are going all over the country and talking with schools about how they're going to try to use AR and VR. What are you finding is that teachers are really valuing about the integration of this technology into their instruction?
Yeah, thank you, Betsy. Thanks, Aaliyah and Jeremy, for being here, and to all of you out there listening. I am officially here as the representative for ZSpace, and I do get to work with schools all over the country as they integrate AR and VR into the instructional process. And I think one of the most exciting parts of what I get to do is I get to see the things that Jeremy talked about come to life in school districts like where Aaliyah is. And I've had the good fortune of getting to be on the ground in Atlanta Public Schools, where they've not only taken the things that we designed for you to be able to do in ZSpace to integrate augmented and virtual reality, but they've even taken it to the next level and started to realize the potential of this AR VR space as a place to create. So what are we finding as we talk to teachers and to leaders across the country, and actually internationally as well? It's very consistent. They like the fact that in an augmented and virtual reality environment, they have this ability to provide access to content that they might not otherwise be able to provide. And that goes right to what Aaliyah's mentioned there as it relates to the sheep part. But equally important, you know, all students are not at the same place in their learning. So some students need that extra push and maybe they're ready to do comparative dissection, while other students are still learning foundational content. So as educators look to differentiate instruction, having content that's virtually available allows them to, on one device, look at different levels of content, different types of content. So that access to content has been critical. We also hear a lot of folks talk about access as it relates to experiences for students. We know that a lot of students are struggling because they lack in their experiences. So this is a safe place where you can give experiences that otherwise you might not be able to. The second thing that Jeremy mentioned is that we find consistently is that virtual reality, augmented reality gives kids the chance to fail. It gives them a chance to fail fast. And then it gives them a chance to get feedback or to think about what they're doing differently so that they can recover and move forward with the learning process. A real specific example that a teacher gave me recently, Aaliyah mentioned electricity. Inside of a space where kids are able to build circuits, include batteries, include resistors, include engines. Well, when they provide too much energy and the engine explodes, they can quickly take it apart, rebuild it, and then redesign their experiment. So without a lot of guidance, they're able to solve their own issues. Now, the next one is really going to be specific to ZSpace, because with ZSpace, the students don't have to put on a head-mounted display. Instead, they put on glasses that allow them to maintain their peripheral, so they can still talk to their peers around them. They can actually work together on experiences. Yesterday in Phoenix City, Alabama, one of the things they felt that really distinguished the experience in AR, VR here is that the kids can collaborate. They can talk to each other as they work through problems, etc. Obviously, engagement of students is increased as they work in a space like this. And then the final thing is just the ability to integrate content as appropriate in the instructional process. So think about AR, VR as something that supplements the learning process just like you would think about a bag of balloons, straws, and meat trays to make those cars that you propel by air. It's not a program. It's not something that you say, hey, we're going to do this for 30 minutes a day. It's something that at the appropriate point in the instructional process, whether you're introducing new content, summarizing it, or differentiating, like I mentioned earlier, you just integrate the experience into the instructional process where it's most relevant and meaningful to support learning of students.
That's
so
terrific.
I could go on forever about the exciting things students find, but those are some of the key things that emerge regardless of where we are, not only in the country, but internationally.
That's great. So let's jump into a couple of questions here. Kika Bryant has asked a really critical question, which is, okay, so in what ways can students actually create their own activities? I would love to hear, Aaliyah, whether you're seeing that in any of your work, Jeremy, what you've experienced as well, and Joe, but you know, part of learning is actually, as you said, doing the creation side. So is there any way that students are creating their own AR and VR activities or videos, or is it still more of the watching, you know, kind of watching videos? Jeremy, maybe you could jump in, or Aaliyah.
Well, I know with ZSpace, some of the tools that they have available, they call it Franklin's Lab or Euclid's Shapes. It's all these different kinds of modules in which students can put circuits together. And it truly is about building an environment, depending on, you know, what that learning module is. So having that creative piece of it lends itself to project-based learning, which is what I'm sure a lot of school districts are leaning towards, or just having authentic learning experiences. But there are lots of different modules in there that allow you to build and create those activities. You can even take a screenshot of what the student has built and have them annotate and explain it to you. So there are tons of different ways for kids to get in there and get creative, collaborating in a group and working through different shapes and pattern blocks and working through math problems with fractions and kind of playing those math problems out to see what actually happens. They do have a lot of student-centered control. That's one of the things I like about what ZSpace offers. And then you have things like, you know, the AR field trips in which, you know, you put on the goggles and you go into that experience, but you don't necessarily get a chance to control it.
Right.
And it's still very valuable, I feel, you know, if I can take them out to see, you know, go into the deep blue sea and they look around and they look at the coral reef, that's great. But you also do have, you know, tools on ZSpace that allow you to create, which is awesome.
And Jeremy, one other question on this front before we leave it is, in other environments, are we seeing any opportunities? So, you know, the work that has to go into creating, you know, like, you know, a seascape video or something like that, that people can experience. It takes some camera work and a lot of other things. Are you seeing any tools start to evolve that actually will put students not just in the position of, again, doing the phenomenal stuff that Aaliyah just described, but also even going that one step further and actually, you know, capturing their environment in some ways or creating it?
Yeah, so with my students, when they come to me with a brilliant idea to create a new VR environment, my first piece of advice to them is, why don't you see what's out there already? Because it turns out there's a lot of stuff out there, and if you can skip that step of building the 3D models and programming the logic of interactivity because someone's already done that, and then as Aaliyah pointed out, the way these things are built is they allow constructivism. They allow you to tweak things and to actually add objects and to take objects away, and they're designed to be malleable and constructive. And so my strong advice is, unless there's something so critically important about your unique scene, try to use what's out there, because let's just get right to the doing.
Fair point. Another question that's come up, and it's a really important one, which is, you know, this is not a tool where the goal is to use it 100% of your school day time. I'd love to hear from all of you. What is, you know, how much time should students be spending in these kinds of environments over the course of whatever, a week, month, school year? You know, how much time is the right amount of time?
I feel like on the front end, we did at one of our schools, and ZSpace was a great partner with this. So we took the units of study that teachers had, and we found where did this easily fit in the curriculum. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's step one, you know, as a teacher, trying to figure out where does this fit? Where does it go? Where can my students benefit from this the most? And I personally feel like you don't limit it until the students get it. You know, if it takes me 3 or 4 days to build that roller coaster to demonstrate Newton's laws, then hey, have at it. Because at the end of the day, on the milestones test, you want to know that they're proficient in understanding and knowing that particular standard. And so whatever it takes to get them there, get them there. And it could be after school. You know, the beauty of the AR, VR space is it doesn't stop in the classroom. If you want to go, you know, and do something after school or have these AR, VR clubs and extend that learning, you can do that. So it doesn't take up valuable class time. But quite frankly, get it done until the students get it. You know, let them immerse themselves into it. If it's a very rich, standards-filled lesson, spend as much time there as you need to. That's just kind of my opinion about it.
Jeremy or Joe, anything you want to add to that?
I'll just add that in general, I talk a lot about with immersive VR and AR, what are the guidelines for safety and health in terms of the amount of time spent. And ZSpace is in a different bucket because you're wearing 3D glasses, but you're still seeing the real world. And you know, you're getting cues about reality constantly. So Aaliyah is literally the world's expert on how one does this in the classroom. And I actually, you know, I can't advise on her advice for how it works in the curriculum, but it sounded perfect to me from a health and safety standpoint. I completely agree with this one. Is they're having fun, they're learning, let them do it, and just with the curriculum should be the guide.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that, first of all, I think that the type of VR and AR that you're going to be working with is going to drive the appropriateness in terms of time frame. Head-mounted display, I think you're going to find is very different experience than screen-based VR like ZSpace. And what we find in schools is that a lot of times the most valuable learning comes when, again, it's integrated in the process. And because some schools do have head-mounted displays, they'll have the students go on an experience in that head-mounted display, Google Cardboard with Google Expedition. And maybe they're in a desert environment. But then what they're able to do is set that VR to the side, go into ZSpace, and they're able to interact in that environment. So maybe they're able to take a snake, put it in the environment, have a hawk in the environment, change it to daytime when the hawk's flying around and the snake's hiding under the rock, and then flip it to night and see the snake come out while the hawk goes and lands on the tree. So a student is able to work in that non-restricted environment that is allowed by having access to what's around you, but still experience the virtual experience a lot longer than maybe the time that they spend in the head-mounted display. I think the other thing that schools think about is the safety risks that you're talking about. And especially when we talk about our elementary students who are, I think even the head-mounted displays say don't use for students under age 13. So the real advantage there is that you can get younger students in the environment and they're not going to have some of the health concerns that you have with a completely immersive environment.
Yeah, and just to build on that, a question that V. Collins here has asked is, and maybe Jeremy, you could speak briefly to this, is from a brain research point of view, what do we know about particularly middle school students, adolescent students, and the amount of screen time, the amount of VR, AR time? Is brain science kind of giving us any insights into, maybe answering this question as well?
So that's a webinar in and of itself. So the person who knows the most about VR, AR, and kids is a woman named Jackie Bailey. She's a professor at the University of Texas. She's run hundreds and hundreds of kids through both immersive VR and desktop VR who are 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, and 6 years old. And she's got some guidelines she's developed in general about kind of best practices there. You know, the good news is with a sample size of hundreds of 3 and 4, 5-year-olds, she hasn't found any negative consequences in terms of eyesight or simulator sickness. You know, she does find that in general, VR tends to be more influential to young kids than, say, just watching a movie, which should be no surprise to anyone who's interested in this topic. It's very compelling. On the brain science side in particular, we have very little research on this, and the reason is almost by definition, VR and AR is about moving, especially moving your head. The best way to measure what happens in the brain is by putting either EEG on you or putting you in the MRI. Both of those, when you physically move, the signal gets either destroyed or reduced in quality so well that it's not worthwhile. So there has been, you know, 10 or 15 studies that put people in the magnet, the MRI machine, before and after. We learn a little bit about what types of activity happens, say, in the hippocampus when you're doing a spatial task in VR. In general, my lab has shown using physiological measures, but more importantly, behavioral measures, that in general, the brain tends to treat a well-crafted VR AR simulation as if it were real. So, you know, we don't know it's identical, but the pattern that we've seen over and over is my line. The reason the book is called Experience on Demand is that one takeaway is that the things we do in these simulations, you know, it activates the sensory motor cortex. You know, we treat this as if it were real because you're literally moving your body.
Yeah,
right?
terrific.
You're not just imagining it, you're actually grabbing that and just.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just to note, we'll put a reference to Jackie Bailey's work from the University of Texas in the follow-up materials that we'll send to you as well. Aaliyah, I'm going to just jump on this point about tactile and physicalness. One of our sort of webinar participants here said, you know, we saw the students using pens in the video, maybe gloves, something like. What are you experiencing with the work that you're doing with your students about the real physicalness of it? Is it still more kind of pen-based, or you know, talk a little bit more, just give us a couple of examples if you could about how's the physics of this working out for kids?
Yeah, it's interesting. We Joe and I have been working on a project in which we were trying to create this 21st century lab at one of our new elementary schools, and we had to consider the space constraints. So if a student is sitting at a ZSpace machine specifically, you don't have to have a ton of space, but you do want the ability to be able to grab the pen and move around. You know, you want to be, it doesn't have to be a big, large space, but it does have to, you do need some space to move. And so far with ZSpace in particular, it's just like grabbing a pencil. It's the same kind of motion. And then there's a button that you push to grab and do. And believe it or not, kids, you know, they catch on to it rather quickly without any issues whatsoever. Unlike, say, an Oculus that Microsoft does, and they kind of have the two controls that we've used those before, and we've had those in a few classrooms. It's a little bit less bulky when a kid can just grab and point to something and click, and they can pull it apart, versus trying to get all of those hand motions in place to literally kind of try to grab. And sometimes you're missing it, kind of becomes really frustrating. I don't think that, in my opinion, that technology has gotten to be as specific as it may need to be in a classroom, because you don't have that kind of time.
Yeah.
So I can't wait for the student to grab the rocket that's moving through the universe. Like, I can't wait for you to get your hands on it. I need you to be able to click it and let's go. And so that's something to consider, but you don't need a ton of space. I would say arm's length, you know, for the kids. Yeah. If you're going to build a lab with, 15 or 20 plus machines in a room.
Gotcha.
But it's been easy for kids to adapt to without any issues.
Super. Russ Altenberg, hey Russ, glad that you're with us on this webinar, asks a really important question, which is, do we know of anyone who's working on this immersive direct-to-consumer environments that bypass the traditional school system? So in other words, you talked, a couple of you mentioned after-school programs. Are you seeing any virtual schools or virtual schooling environments? I think that's what Russ meant. that are really taking advantage of this. Anyone?
That's interesting. I run the virtual school as well, and we've not delved into it. I think because our virtual school students are online, basically in a content platform. I don't know how we would, and Joe, maybe you can help us with this, is how they could see it and we could see it at the same time. I don't know what that technology looks like.
Interesting.
Yeah, we're actually getting ready to launch a really large scale project in a state where they're going to take the ZSpace laptop and use it with their students who are participating in the virtual school program. And what they're having to do is take their virtual school curriculum and then align the experiences in ZSpace to that curriculum, and the students will complete the experience at the appropriate time and sequence in the instructional process. Now, that's one example. Another example is in the homeschool market. We have a lot of parents who make that choice for their family. And when making that choice, it's an opportunity for them to provide hands-on experiences virtually that maybe they wouldn't be able to because of DICE. It's dangerous, impossible, etc. So it's certainly something that, and I know folks that I've talked a lot about what we're doing at ZSpace, but if you step back from the product specific conversation, you know, the challenge is to think about how do you take anything that you want to integrate into instruction and make it effective. So it could be virtual reality, it could be a new book that you found that you want your child to engage with, etc. So I think the challenge is to think about your context and how can something like this fit in. And like Aaliyah said, that's where a lot of my role and my team and colleagues at ZSpace, we like to work with folks to make their vision come alive. A related question that popped up in our chat related to alternative schools. You know, a lot of alternative schools, and because I was a high school principal for a little while working with students who went to an alternative school, an alternative school teacher sometimes is told, you're teaching science, but these kids are taking biology, these 4 are taking chemistry, these 6 are taking physics, and by the way, we want that kid to get environmental science credit while that kid's getting anatomy, physiology. So if you think of the number of preparations that teacher has to deliver quality instruction, it's really impossible to do because, and unrealistic. However, now you have the ability to give that lab experience in a virtual space, and kids can be working on the same device, but doing different things with different content. So the one other question that popped up over here was related to art. And Betsy, is it okay for me to go ahead and?
Well, you read my mind, Joe, because in fact I was gonna try to move our collective conversation to non-STEM for a moment, which is art. We've had questions about English, language arts, and also the soft skills. So I'd love to hear the panel talk a little bit. I think, Jeremy, you started to kind of mention the fascinating idea of kind of trying to build empathy with these environments. So let's take a couple minutes and talk about the non-science applications of AR and VR. Jeremy, I'm going to ask you to start us on that because you did get us started with this tantalizing idea of building empathy with AR and VR.
Yeah, thanks, Betsy. So this is one of the home runs of VR and AR, which is putting someone in a social situation. Maybe it's a public speaking, maybe it's a job interview training, maybe it's the better way to do diversity inclusion training. You put them, with a DICE framework in a room of 100 people, or in a room with 43 women and 7 men, or you put them in a situation that's intense based on a bullying scenario, and you get to have them, practice and get instruction, and these are things that you should think about. Here's how you should help this person. And you get them to basically, in a realistic way, have a social interaction where perhaps that you've changed their body, and they do something called body transfer, which is the neuroscientific term for stepping into an avatar that's different from you, and it feels like it's you. And for 20 years, we've been studying how can you improve, the way that somebody thinks about others, or the way that they behave towards others. More importantly, does that change subsequent, the way that they look at someone and the way that they talk to people? It's an amazing tool, and I think it's when I speak to corporations and to organizations and nonprofits and schools, everyone's talking about soft skills training right now. Can we, is there anything that we can do to kind of help this polarization, this intensity? And to be clear, I don't think VR is going to solve all the world's problems, but it's a tool that when used well can definitely augment and help us chip away at some of these soft skills issues.
Yeah, great. Joe or Leah, and Joe, you can definitely go back to the art thing as well. But again, just other applications that we're seeing that are go beyond the sciences.
Well, specifically in the area of art, being able to sculpt, there are applications out there where students can sculpt virtually. We do offer one called Leopoly. And actually within Leopoly, I noticed in the chat someone mentioned Merge, but you can take the content that the student sculpts, you can put it into the Merge object viewer, and then students can see it there. Likewise, they can come into ZSpace and visualize it. So from a creation standpoint, that's one example. But the other one is, I just read today, because I received a report from the Electronic Imaging and the Visual Arts. They just had a conference in Florence a few days ago. And the director of the Texas Tech Museum of Art, along with some graduate students, they took their collection of Southwestern American pottery, which is typically not even on display. They scanned those images, imported them into a VR space. In this case, it was ZSpace, and they make that collection available to students. Which is important because not only can they make it available to students for interaction at the museum site, but they can then take it and push it out to more remote areas in their state. So there, again, that access issue is being addressed. So for those who might be interested, check out Texas Tech Museum of Art, and you'll see how an institution is using that VR, AR to deliver their content.
That's terrific. And we'll also make sure we put that in the list of follow-up resources that we're sharing out. And I also see a couple of questions here about like which ZSpace applications are the best for soft skills. I'd love to put that into the follow-up materials, and we can then you can kind of go through that. There's one subject that I want to make sure we do take a couple of minutes to touch on, which is assessment. So one of the challenges that obviously even project-based learning has always had is, are you measuring the skill sets that students are building? And I wonder if we could just take a minute and talk about what are some of the challenges. I mean, at the end of the day, state tests are still bubble tests, right? And if AR and VR are going to be compelling ways of genuinely giving students learning experiences, how well is that mapping to the assessments? Aaliyah, I think you guys are probably wrestling with some of these questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to figure out, are they really learning it? It doesn't matter if it's AR, VR, or if it's a great experiment or something that the teacher came up in with the class in the classroom. I look at ZSpace, as I'm sure anyone else would in the education space, as a formative way to assess students. They do have a lot of built-in ways to ask questions. Teachers can go in and customize and add a question to a certain space, fill in the blank. They can edit questions. Like I said, they can save their screen and then come back and annotate and explain. That's been one of the best ways that we've tried to implement assessment with AR and VR. But you have to have active conversations with your students, set goals for them, and what do I want to accomplish after I've spent this time in this environment, and did I accomplish that? And if I did, tell me exactly what you did to accomplish it. And so at the end of the day, we want our kids to be proficient in the standards. So whatever gets us there, I think it's fine however you get there, but you got to get there. You can't use it as, you know, a place to go play or to go sit or extra time. You know, teachers have these little things that we do, but it's definitely not built for that. If you're looking for just a time waster, find a real less expensive way to do that.
Yeah.
If you invest in this, you need to also invest in that learning and teaching cycle that includes assessment, and it's authentic assessment. You understand the student get what they were supposed to get from doing this particular thing.
Yeah,
And
I think that's
today,
such
they'll
a
be
good
great
point.
on the milestones. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeremy, anything else you want to add that you've seen that people are doing on the assessment side? And then the last question we absolutely want to come back to is cost too. So, but Jeremy, talk about assessment and what you're seeing.
So this is the huge future opportunity, which is in academia. We know for Andrew Stevenson-Wan, she's a professor at Cornell University. She published a paper in 2016 that shows if you put someone in a simulation and you actually record their hand movements and their head movements, you know, with VR and AR, you record that at 90 frames a second over a 20-minute learning period. You've got about 2 million data points of how body language functions during instruction, during receiving information. Andrew has demonstrated that when you use machine learning algorithms, feeding as input the body language during instruction and predicting test score, she can predict your eventual test score with 86% accuracy based on your body language as automatically measured by the VR AR system when you were getting instructed. So that's still academic work, but I see that as, I always give my Stanford students, I've got a class, it's 200 people in the VR people class, and I say, I'm gonna give you guys a choice. You can have your grade based on the midterm, the final, the bubble test, or I can track all of your body language throughout the rest of this course, and based on these algorithms, we can figure out what your grade is based on your engagement and body language during that. No one ever chooses. No one ever chooses that. No one ever
chooses that. That's amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
well, I think we gotta get those students really focused.
Well, yeah, students have also learned how to take tests and get grades, right? So that's, but I see it as an epically large opportunity, because forget assessment in terms of ultimate score. If we want to dynamically change the learning material presented based on the comprehension level halfway through a lesson, you can do that automatically and simultaneously at scale. It's really neat.
I think, Jeremy, you got to start requiring that people students let you grade them that way. I think that would be fascinating.
I'll have you talk to Stanford about that.
Absolutely. I want to get to cost, and Joe, we're going to bring you into this part of the conversation. So, Aaliyah, you had made the point that, gosh, going out and buying a dozen sheep hearts, it's both expensive for the teacher, and you can't really do that for 120 students. But there is also this real big setup cost that people are kind of concerned about. I'd love to hear about how you, in a district, in schools, kind of think about the cost. And then, Joe, quite frankly, I'd love to hear the experiences that you've had as you talk to school districts, including some that, are totally counting their pennies every single day.
Yeah.
What does this cost? And not just was it cost like the first moment, but when you start to think about the professional development that teachers need and the ongoing support, what does this kind of a program really cost?
I think once you consider that you want to venture into AR, VR, you've got to look at what are some of the learning goals of the school. We have one school where I think that cost, it was a no-brainer to do something like this. We partnered with, I won't say who the partner was, but they donated an automotive bay to the school, because part of, and we didn't talk about a lot about career tech, but in the career tech space, for one of our schools, it's automotive mechanics. And so although they donated this bay, we still got to get cars donated. We still have to get, certain things, certain diagnostic tools. So for this particular school, it was easier to invest in ZSpace machines that have these CTE modules on there. They've got an automotive mechanic, an automotive expert, and you got all these things at your fingertips, and it's less messy and more students can participate. So if you're thinking on large scale or something like that, it's kind of a no-brainer. I think where your costs are going to come in when you kind of are penny pinching a little bit is if it's just local school trying to outfit a lab. The beauty I think of a ZSpace is you don't have to think about it being one-to-one. One-to-one is probably the utopia of AR/VR. You don't have to have that. Kids like to collaborate, and you'll see them most times. If you go to some of my tweets, you'll see kids gathered around 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 machines.
So what's the rough ratio that you're having if you don't have a one-to-one?
About 3 to 1 is what we think will be awesome, because they collaborate in groups of 3, and 3 is probably pretty comfortable. And I'll let Joe speak to more of this around the machine, and they can share and they do things. And remember, they still have the outside world is available to them. So they're planning and trying to figure out what they're going to do on that machine. But support and professional development is a big, big piece of the sustainability of this. I fortunately am in a department in instructional technology where we have 16 educational technology specialists. And those specialists, ZSpace comes out, they train them. We get training probably once every couple of months, what's new. And they go in and they do co-teaching with teachers around ZSpace. The only thing that we found that really works, because no teacher wants to fail in front of 36th graders. I think no one wants to do that. They don't wake up and say, oh, today's going to be one of those days when I just bomb. So you have that support that's there, that knows the technology, that understands what you're doing, and that teacher provides that content knowledge. It's the perfect parent. And so if your district does not have someone there who can work in the classroom with those teachers, that's something to consider doing for the sustainability of something like that.
Yeah,
great.
That's really helpful. Joe, we don't want to put you on the spot, but just give us a little bit of a sense of the range. And I'll ask you to do this, in just kind of a short amount of detail. Just give us a little bit of the range that schools and districts realistically should think about when they think about how to prepare for doing this kind of work.
Well, as some people have indicated in the webinar chat, there are some very low-cost solutions that allow them to integrate AR, VR. But if you're looking at something more comprehensive that meets all your curriculum areas, vertically, all grade levels, and is robust in terms of offering you curriculum support, you're going to look at something more like the ZSpace product. Now, it is a hardware software solution. You cannot experience the things that you experience on your typical all-in-one computer in the classroom or laptop. There are some enhanced features that allow you to experience the images floating in the air. So you have to have the hardware, which ranges anywhere from $1,500 in a laptop space to around $3,000 in the all-in-one space. Then I tell people it's just like buying your iPad or your Android tablet. You choose which applications you want to subscribe to based on how you're going to use it. So while I've talked a little bit about some numbers, what does a typical implementation look like? We discourage people from just buying one device. If you buy one device, you're not truly creating an integration that's going to impact those assessments that you mentioned anymore. It's going to be more of a field trip. Oh, today we're doing ZSpace versus ZSpace is when we're teaching cells, when we're teaching motion, when we're doing art. It's a part of our thinking about how we deliver instruction. So you want to adopt in a 1-to-1 ratio if you're looking at laptops, or a 2-to-1 ratio if you're looking at all-in-ones. So I tell people, think about your largest class size and then build your plan based on that.
Terrific.
The last thing I want to share, and I don't like to talk about costs without talking about leadership and vision, because you have to have leadership and vision to make it happen, whether it's through Perkins funds, Title I dollars, community fundraisers. The school district I was in yesterday raised $1.1 million. Their free reduced lunch rate is 88%, so it is a high poverty district, low skill. So you have to have the commitment to doing it.
Yeah, well, that's great. And in fact, that leads me, Joe, to kind of the last quick question for each of you, and you've almost pre-answered it, I think, which is, what's one lesson learned that you have had as you have been on this journey of learning about AR, VR, and the role that it plays in classrooms. And I think, Joe, you actually just kind of suggested the answer, which is that leadership really matters, and understanding kind of both how you're doing and why you're doing it. But let me give each of you just 1 minute to share a real lesson learned that you've had on this journey. Aaliyah, you want to get us started?
Lesson learned is plan, 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 and plan again. This is not the type of software that you think about on the day of you doing instruction. There is a lot of planning that goes into this. Having the students to be prepared to do it and having the teacher to be prepared to deliver it. So just having them involved in that planning process, in their lesson planning, in the units of study, where does this fit? Where does it make sense? So that you're not just wasting time. It's not you're playing a game, but kids are engaged in learning. And then the more that you allow time and space, that you allow teachers to get used to this technology, they have to practice it on their own. It's definitely learning by doing. It's not one of those things you can just say, hey, kids, go on there and figure it out. You kind of got to immerse yourself into it as a teacher as well.
That's fantastic. Joe,
Yeah.
anything you want to add there in terms of the lessons learned that you've had?
Yeah, I just challenge people, and it relates to leadership, is remember why we have school. We have school for the kids, and not the kids that we were, not the kids that our parents were, not the kids that we taught 5 years ago. And we're preparing these kids for jobs that in a lot of cases don't exist. So leadership can build barriers, leadership can break down barriers. So work with your leadership to build vision and then execute on that. And we find consistently people are able to find a way to fund it and ultimately impact what's happening with kids.
Terrific. Jeremy, bring us home here.
Yeah, my final point is going to be about body movement. And this is, when you get in VR and you see the wonder and awe of this object floating in the air, that's amazing. And a lot of that is what brings us to the experience for motivation. What we found in the lab in terms of predicting learning transfer and efficacy, it's really about how you're moving your body and the fact that you get to actually cut through something and feel a little bit of resistance, and that you're turning your head this way to look at something over there. So encourage movements, give them the space and the support so that they're actually using their bodies and doing stuff. It will increase the transfer and efficacy of the learning.
That's fantastic. So I want to thank all of you. This has been the shortest hour I've had all week. I wish we could go on much longer than that. But a special thanks to ZSpace, which has been the sponsor. And again, I think you've all heard a lot about ZSpace on this, but obviously they're providing the experiences and medium to support instruction and students' learning and curiosity. And you can obviously find out more at zspace.com. I am Betsy Corcoran, CEO of EdSurge, and once again, we aim to provide all the resources and news that you need to have about how technology is shaping the ways that we learn and teach. We have free newsletters and all sorts of things at edsurge.com, and we will absolutely follow up this webinar with a list of resources that we've discussed and a link to the recorded webinar in a follow-up email. We'd also love to hear from any of you out there who've enjoyed this webinar. What topics would you like to see us talk about in the future? We would love your feedback as well. So once again, thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.